Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the deep dive. Ready for something a little different today?
Oh, yeah, this one's going to be interesting.
Yeah, we're talking about cannibalism.
Intense, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely not your average dinner table conversation.
Definitely not.
But before you think we've gone full horror movie here, I want to be clear.
Mm.
We're actually going to be looking at the history of cannibalism, like the real deal, you know?
Yeah, I think people will be surprised by how much history there actually is there.
Yeah, it's a lot more than just scary stories, right?
Definitely.
So, lots to dig into today. I'm really curious to see what we find out.
Yeah, me too.
The goal is to basically figure out, like, what are the different types of cannibalism? Explore why people engaged in it, and maybe even, challenge some of our own assumptions along the way.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have assumptions going in
Yeah,
that
totally.
might get flipped on their head.
For sure. What I find fascinating already is that cannibalism isn't just like this random savage act.
Right.
It's like a human phenomenon that's been around for a long time, and it's been practiced in different ways, across different cultures, different time periods. Really complex.
Yeah, really complex. And that's why it's so interesting to study.
Totally agree. Okay, so let's start with the basics, I guess. What exactly is cannibalism? I feel like we need a clear definition before we jump in.
Yeah, definitely. Cannibalism, also known as anthropophagy, is basically the act of humans eating the flesh or the internal organs of other humans.
So human eating another human.
Exactly. And it's interesting, the term is also used in zoology for animals that eat members of their own species.
So it's not just a human thing, but for this deep dive, we're going to be sticking with the humans, right?
Yeah, definitely focusing on the human side of things.
Makes sense. Now, the research mentions different types of cannibalism. Can you break those down for us?
Absolutely. We can categorize cannibalism in three main types: institutionalized, survival, and pathological.
Okay, let's start with institutionalized cannibalism. What does that even mean? It sounds very structured and formal.
It is. Institutionalized cannibalism is basically when eating human body parts is like a culturally accepted practice.
Okay.
So it's woven into the fabric of their society, has specific rituals and beliefs around it.
Hmm. So it's not just like a random act, but something with deeper meaning within that culture.
Exactly. A classic example is the Four Tribe in New Guinea.
Okay.
They practiced mortuary cannibalism where they would eat the remains of their deceased relatives, specifically the brains.
Oh, wow.
And they believed this honored the dead and kept their spirits alive.
That's a completely different way of thinking about death than what I'm used to.
Right.
It really shows how different the beliefs about cannibalism can be. Are there other examples of this type of
Oh,
cannibalism?
yeah, many. Within this category, we distinguish between exocannibalism and endocannibalism.
Wow. Even more specifics. Okay. What's the difference?
Exocannibalism is the eating of people outside of one's community, often enemies in warfare. It was seen as a way to absorb their strength or humiliate them.
Oh, I see.
The island Caribs, whose name actually gave us the word cannibal, were known for this.
Oh, wow. So the word cannibal itself comes from a specific group and practice.
It does.
That's pretty interesting.
Hmm.
What about endocannibalism? How is that different?
Endocannibalism involves eating people within one's own community,
Okay.
often as part of funerary rituals. So it's less about aggression and more about reverence for the deceased.
Oh, I see. So like a way of incorporating them back into the community, maybe?
Exactly.
It's amazing how cannibalism can have these completely different meanings and purposes, from aggression to reverence. Okay, so that's institutionalized cannibalism. What about survival cannibalism? I'm guessing that one's a bit more straightforward, right?
Yeah, survival cannibalism is pretty much what it sounds like.
Okay,
A desperate act in extreme situations like famines, shipwrecks, or sieges, where people resort to eating human flesh just to survive.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
I can imagine those situations just push people to their absolute limits. Are there any famous examples of this?
Oh, yeah, the story of the Donner Party. They were a group of American pioneers who got snowbound in the Sierra Nevada mountains back in the winter of 1846.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. That's a rough story.
Yeah, they were facing starvation and ended up resorting to consuming the bodies of the deceased just to survive.
That's a really haunting story.
It is.
Makes you wonder how far you would go to survive in that kind of situation.
Yeah, it's a really tough question.
Are there legal implications around survival cannibalism? Is it ever considered acceptable under the law?
There are legal implications,
Hmm.
and it's rarely considered acceptable. A landmark case is the 1884 legal case of R.V. Dudley and Stevens.
Okay, I don't know that one. What happened?
Two shipwrecked sailors killed and ate a cabin boy to survive.
Oh, wow.
And they tried to use the custom of the sea defense, claiming it was necessary for survival,
I see.
but it was rejected and they were convicted of murder.
Wow.
This case basically set a precedent that necessity is not a defense for murder, even in really dire circumstances.
So even in a life or death scenario, the law doesn't necessarily condone cannibalism.
Yeah.
That's a really morally complex issue, isn't it?
Oh, for sure.
Okay, so that brings us to the last type,
Yeah.
pathological cannibalism.
Yeah.
What sets this one apart?
Pathological cannibalism is linked to mental disorders, so it's considered like aberrant behavior.
Okay.
It's driven by psychological factors rather than like cultural practices or survival needs.
So not about tradition or desperation, but something within the individual.
Exactly. A famous figure who falls into this category is Albert Fish. He was an American serial killer who preyed on children in the early 20th century.
That's dark.
Yeah, he was known for his disturbing cannibalistic tendencies.
That's a much darker side to this whole topic. So we've got these three main types: institutionalized, survival, and pathological. It's really interesting how they differ in their motivations and context. But I've noticed a question keeps popping up in the research. Some scholars are actually skeptical about how prevalent cannibalism really was, calling it a myth. What's that all about?
That's right. There's this debate in anthropology called the cannibalism debate, sparked by William Ahrens's book, The Man-Eating Myth.
Yeah.
He argues that evidence of cannibalism is often exaggerated or fabricated to portray certain cultures as savage and justify, like, colonial exploitation.
Oh, I see.
So basically, using cannibalism as a tool to dehumanize other groups for their own gain.
Yeah, that's a heavy accusation. But then you have all this archaeological evidence that seems to contradict that. What do you make of that conflict?
Well, most anthropologists disagree with Ahrens. They point to archaeological evidence like human bones with cut marks and signs of butchering, as well as genetic markers suggesting widespread cannibalism in the past.
Really?
Yeah, so it seems like the evidence actually points to cannibalism being a real phenomenon, even if some accounts might be exaggerated or used for ulterior motives.
So a lot to unpack there, both historical and ethical implications.
Yeah.
But I guess I keep coming back to the question, why is there such a strong taboo surrounding cannibalism in the first place?
That's a great question.
And why does it repulse us so much?
Yeah, it really gets at the heart of what makes cannibalism so intriguing.
Yeah.
It forces us to confront our own mortality, our primal instincts, and the boundaries of what we even consider acceptable human behavior.
Right. It's not just about the act of eating human flesh. It's about something deeper, like psychological and cultural implications.
Exactly.
It really makes you think about those deep-seated cultural norms
Yeah.
and how they shape our perceptions. This is where it gets really interesting for me. Now, before we dive into specific examples of cannibalistic practices, the research mentions some sensitive content regarding the nutritional aspects of the human body. So we want to be mindful of your comfort level. Feel free to skip ahead a bit if this topic's too much. We'll let you know when we move on. But for those of you who are curious, let's see what the research says.
Okay, sure. One researcher, James Cole, looked at this from a purely scientific perspective. He found that the human body's nutritional value is pretty similar to animals of a similar size. So we've got protein, fat, calories, just like other animals, nothing special there.
So we're not a superfood or anything.
Not really, but the sources also mention that some cultures favored specific body parts.
Like what kind of details are we talking about?
Well, hearts and livers are mentioned a lot, often in warfare. It seems there was a belief that consuming these organs, especially those of your enemies, would transfer their strength or courage to the eater.
Wow, that's interesting.
And in some cultures, especially in Melanesia and parts of Africa, there are accounts of a preference for women's breasts, palms, and soles of the feet.
Why is that?
Well, the reasons for this are varied, ranging from beliefs about their taste and texture to the symbolic significance attached to those parts.
It's incredible how diverse and complex these motivations and practices are. It's clear that just labeling cannibalism as, like, savage or primitive is really oversimplifying it. There's so much more nuance to it than that.
Absolutely, and that's what makes studying it so valuable. It challenges our preconceived notions and forces us to broaden our understanding of human behavior.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm way more fascinated by this topic now than I was at the beginning.
Me too.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the different types of cannibalism to the cultural and ethical debates.
Yeah, and we've only just scratched the surface.
Oh, I bet. There's still so much more to explore.
So much more.
Let's move on to the medical aspects of cannibalism after a quick word from our sponsors. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. Ready to keep going with this cannibalism thing?
I am. That last segment was a lot. But I gotta say, it was fascinating. I had no idea. So much to this whole topic.
Yeah, most people don't.
What do we have in store for this part of our deep dive?
Let's shift gears a bit and explore some of the medical aspects of cannibalism. There's actually connections between cannibalism and disease,
Okay.
but also potentially protection from disease.
Wait, hold on. How can something be both harmful and protective when it comes to disease?
It's kind of complicated. Remember our earlier discussion about the Four tribe in New Guinea and their practice of mortuary cannibalism?
Yeah, the one where they consume the brains of their deceased relatives?
Right. Well, this practice led to the spread of a really deadly prion disease called kuru.
Hold on. A prion disease. Can you explain what that is? I've never heard of that before.
Prion diseases are caused by misfolded proteins that can damage the brain.
Oh, okay.
They're incredibly rare,
Okay.
but very serious, always fatal.
Gotcha.
What happened with the four people is that by consuming infected brain tissue, they were basically transmitting these misfolded proteins to themselves.
So in that case, cannibalism directly led to a medical consequence.
It did. Kuru caused severe neurological damage, tremors, loss of coordination, and eventually death. But here's where it gets interesting. Research suggests that a specific genetic marker found in many people worldwide might have actually evolved as protection against prion diseases like Kuru.
Wait, are you saying that cannibalism could have driven a genetic adaptation?
That's the theory.
Wow, that's mind-blowing.
It is. Populations with a history of cannibalism, particularly brain consumption, faced a higher risk of prion disease, right?
Right.
Those who carried this genetic marker were less susceptible, giving them a survival advantage.
So the marker would become more common over time.
Exactly.
So in a strange way, a practice that spreads a deadly disease also leads to a genetic defense against it.
It's pretty wild.
It really is. It makes you think about the connections between culture, biology, and evolution.
All tied together. It's a reminder that even practices that seem taboo or harmful can have unexpected consequences and can shape us in ways we never imagined.
Okay, so that's the medical side of things.
Yeah.
Definitely makes you think. But what about like the cultural representations of cannibalism? I know it pops up a lot in myths and legends. What can we learn from those stories?
Yeah, you're right. Cannibalism is a theme that comes up again and again in mythology and folklore from all these different cultures. And it's almost always portrayed in a negative light,
Yeah.
reflecting those deep-seated fears and taboos we talked about earlier.
Right, right. Can you give some examples?
Think about the witch in Hansel and Gretel,
Oh, yeah.
who lures children into her candy house to fatten them up and eat them.
Oh, that's terrifying.
Right. Or the Wendigo, a cannibalistic spirit in Algonquian legend, often depicted as a creature that embodies greed, hunger, and the dangers of consuming human flesh.
Okay, yeah, those are some pretty scary stories.
And then you've got figures from Greek mythology, like Cronus, who devoured his own children, and the monstrous Lamia, known for stealing and devouring children.
Wow. Yeah, those stories definitely paint a pretty grim picture of cannibalism.
They do. And while these are just myths, they reflect that deep-seated fear and revulsion that cannibalism evokes in many cultures.
Yeah.
It could be a way of exploring our darkest impulses, and anxieties,
Yeah.
the consequences of violating fundamental social norms.
Right, so it's like they're cautionary tales,
Yeah,
warning us against crossing that line.
exactly.
This deep dive has definitely challenged my own assumptions about cannibalism. It's so much more than just a horrifying act. It's a window into human history, culture, biology, and even, like, our deepest fears.
I agree. And it raises so many questions about what it means to be human, the choices we make in extreme situations,
Yeah.
and the power of culture to shape our behavior.
It's been a really eye-opening exploration, and I'm left wondering about the ethics of cannibalism in those extreme survival situations, like we talked about with the Donner Party. Is it ever truly justifiable? It feels impossible to really judge from where we sit.
Yeah, that's a really tough one. Really pushes us to the edge of our moral boundaries. You
Yeah.
got that instinct for self-preservation, that desperate drive to survive, but at what cost? And then on the other hand, you have, like, the sanctity of human life and the respect that we accord to the deceased.
Right. It seems like there's no easy answer there.
Right.
The law might condemn it, but in those situations facing death, can we really judge those who resort to those measures?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder,
Yeah.
what would you do?
What would I do? It's a question that philosophers, ethicists have grappled with for centuries. There's no simple right or wrong answer, you know. It really forces us to confront those complexities of human nature and those gray areas of morality. It's easy to judge from a distance, but in the heat of the moment, facing those unimaginable choices, who knows how any of us would react?
Yeah, for sure. This deep dive has taken us to some pretty dark, thought-provoking places.
It has.
But I feel like I've learned so much about a topic that I really knew very little about before.
Yeah.
What stands out to you as like the most surprising or intriguing aspect of cannibalism?
For me, it's the sheer diversity of the practices and all the different meanings attached to it, from like ritualistic reverence for the dead to desperate acts of survival to like the disturbing world of mental illness. Cannibalism is anything but one-dimensional. Really makes you question your assumptions, doesn't it?
It does. I agree. What I find fascinating is how cannibalism intersects with our understanding of human evolution.
Oh, interesting. Like the fact that a genetic marker linked to prion disease resistance might be so widespread suggests a deep and perhaps disturbing connection to our past. Makes you wonder how prevalent cannibalism really was in our evolutionary history and how it might have shaped who we are today.
That is a chilling thought. Well, we've only just scratched the surface of this complex and often taboo subject. But hopefully this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and challenged some of your assumptions. What resonated with you the most? What questions are you still grappling with? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the surprisingly complex history of cannibalism. Until next time.